Burnside takes
So where I left my water, so I'm gonna go out and get a drink and then I'll be back. Okay.
He finally begins his march toward Lee's right flank, leaving 2 full brigades in reserve. He intends to cut off Lee's retreat. His 1-mile route attack is initially successful, with 1 division pushing toward the Harper's Ferry River, while elements of 2 other brigades come to blows with D.R. Jones' Confederates. Only Robert Toombs' 700-man brigade is left to defend Lee's right flank. Many Confederates panic and run wild through the streets of Sharpsburg. But at 4 p.m., A.P. Hill's Light Division arrives after a forced march from Harper's Ferry. Despite their 17-mile march that day, Hill's exhausted men immediately strike Burnside's exposed left flank. Made up largely of new and inexperienced troops, these green troops stand in high form and barely see what's required. A.P. Hill's timely arrival saves Lee's army. 12 hours of savage bloodshed has withered Lee's army to 30,000. Though the fighting is ended, he remains on the field till the next day, ready for battle. McClellan considers an attack.
Well, that's what the speaker's here for. Wait a minute. Okay, want to turn up a little? I think you can hear me now. Well, welcome everyone to the February meeting of the Roundtable. For those who have not met, I'm Mark Stoller, president of the Roundtable. I saw a lot of new faces today. How many are here for the first time? Well, thank you very much for coming. And how many of you are new members this year? Well, we got a few here. Okay, great. Well, thanks. One of the things we do each year is we do donations for battlefield preservation and for Civil War related projects. Usually we do those late in the season and we announce them at our May meeting. However, we had the opportunity to do something that had a time deadline. So our board met recently and has made a substantial donation on your behalf, on behalf of the Roundtable. One thing we try to do is to maximize value with either matching opportunities or very targeted donations where we might get recognition. What we had come up with through the American Battlefield Trust was a 54-to-1 matching opportunity at several battlefields of the Western Theater, and it was expiring within a few weeks. So in order to help that effort, we have donated $4,100, which has a value of $221,000, given the matching funds, towards 4 projects. Earthworks at Browns Ferry, and Browns Ferry is critical to the supply route that Grant established for the besieged army at Chattanooga in the fall of 1863. The second is for 12 acres in the heart of the battlefield at Spring Hill, Tennessee, which is where General Hood made his attempt to cut off General Schofield unsuccessfully. And the day before the battle, the Battle of Franklin. The third is 118 acres in 2 locations at the Bentonville battlefield in North Carolina, which is Joe Johnston's last attempt to stop Sherman in the spring of 1865. And the fourth is from the beginning of the war. It's Fort Hyman, which is part of the Fort Henry site of Fort Henry and Donaldson fame in Tennessee, which was threatened by high-density residential development. Our donation provides about 6% of the total funds that are going to be needed by the American Battlefield Trust to trigger the match. So it's a big, big donation on behalf of everyone who's a member of the Roundtable. Thank you for both your membership and donations that made this possible. I also want to mention that earlier this season, we made a $900 donation to the Blue and Gray Education Society for marker signs at the Perryville, Kentucky battlefield site. And on those signs, which help mark the battlefield, the Scottsdale Civil War Roundtable will be designated as the donor. So there'll be a sign with our name there. So if any of you visit Perryville, please send us pictures. With these donations over the past decade, the Roundtable has made $46,500 in donations, which with matching grants allowed the acquisitions of parcels with a value of nearly $2.6 million. Wow. So again, thank you all. A couple of other announcements. We will be having our history discussion group meeting next Thursday, the 27th of February, from 6 to 7:30 at the Wildflower Cafe at the intersection of Scottsdale and Indian Bend Road. That's a place where we have a member-facilitated discussion on a Civil War related topic, and for instance, usually related to our speaker. And the discussion next week will be, could McClellan have ended the war at Antietam? And it's for those of you who haven't been, very informal. We may vary a bit from the topic at times, but it goes wherever we want to have the discussion go. It's a lot of fun, and we've been having good attendance. So we urge everybody, people to visit us. What time? 6 to 7:30, Thursday, February 27th. And we have our own meeting room there. On book donations, just as a reminder, if you do have book donations, just let Pat Toftoy know we are accepting donations up to a box per person, but nothing more than that because we still have quite an inventory we're working through. But we appreciate the donations we've been getting recently. The next two weekends, next two Saturdays are the first two regional competitions for National History Day in Arizona. We're working with the Arizona Historical Society. There are a number of members who are going to be judges for that contest. So we want to thank those of you who have volunteered to be judges. It's very important. It's a fun exercise, but it's also important for the relationship building we're trying to do with other history-oriented organizations. Okay, one note here. For those of you who get the grape shot, has anybody had trouble getting the grape shot or has not been getting it monthly? Okay. If anybody who should be getting it is not, please let me know. I had a couple of contacts recently from people who weren't getting it, and I told them to go look in their spam folders, where it turns out it ended up for whatever reason. Unfortunately, I can't send out a blanket note on constant contact to our members because if it's going to spam, you're not going to see it. So for those of you here, if you have any problems, let me know and I'll or look in your spam folder. I want to also say again, next month's meeting is not on Tuesday the 18th. It's on Wednesday, March 19th. We moved that to avoid the spring training game here, so that people will actually be able to park when they come. Last year we had, unfortunately, a conflict, and there are a number of people I know who couldn't find a place to park near the library. So we fixed that. We'll keep sending out reminders for that. With that, I'm going to turn it over to our program chair, John Taylor.
Thank you, Mark. Good evening, everybody. I'm John Taylor, and as Mark said, I'm the program coordinator for the Roundtable. And tonight, we're very honored to be joined by Dr. Alex Rossino. And we're going to give you a little bit of background on Alex. He started out as a World War II historian and studied at Syracuse and authored a book on Hitler's invasion of Poland, and actually worked at the U.S. Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. for a number of years. And then he got bit by the Civil War bug. And his first foray into Civil War was historical fiction. So he wrote two volumes, one on Lee's army and one on McClellan's army. You can buy those on Amazon. They also have audiobooks if you're interested. And then he got intrigued and swallowed into a rabbit hole on the history of Special Order 191, and has written 2 books. This is his most recent book on Special Order 191, which he's going to talk about tonight, which is Calamity at Frederick. If you haven't read it, we have books for sale. I've read it. It's an excellent book, and I'm really, really, really excited to welcome Alex Rossino. Thanks, Tom.
Great, thank you. It's hard to see with all the with the light in your face. All right, great. Thank you so much. It is really an honor to be here. I'm really happy to see so many people who are interested in history. I don't care if your hair is gray. My hair is all gray too. When I can't move around because we're online, so I'll stay right here. The first thing I want to ask is just to get a general idea of who knows what Special Orders 191 were. So it looks like about 40%. How about Lee's Lost Orders? Have you heard them referred to that way? Okay, so that's a bit more, but there's still a group of people who don't really know what the subject is. Okay. Let me give you a background. I'll give you the 30,000 foot summary of the whole thing. So during the Maryland campaign, which started at the beginning of September in 1862, when Lee took his army across the river, Potomac River, into Maryland in an effort to liberate the state from federal military occupation. George McClellan took his army and collected it outside of Washington, D.C., and then started on the 7th of September, pushing up toward Frederick. By the 13th of September, Frederick is a city where there are 2 major routes that run from Baltimore in the east to Frederick in the center of the state, and Washington, D.C. in the south to the center of the state. So it's kind of a converging point, important point. And from that point, the road then goes over 2 mountain ranges, the Catoctin Mountain Range, which is a low mountain range. Well, compared to the mountains that you have out here in the west, everything's a low mountain range in the east, but it's a really low mountain range. And then after that, there's the Blue Ridge Mountains, which in Maryland is known as South Mountain. Lee took his army from Frederick, where he camped between the 6th of September to the 10th of September, north and west up to Hagerstown, or the area around Hagerstown, which is then past past South Mountain. On the 13th, McClellan's army occupied, really the evening of the 12th, but on the 13th, most of McClellan's army was moving through in 2 columns through Frederick City. And outside of Frederick, southeast of Frederick, a soldier corporal from the 27th Indiana named Barton Mitchell found a packet lying in the grass, the tall grass. And I'll get more into detail about that, but I'm giving you just the overview right now. In that packet this is the story that you'll read in every book except mine. There were 3 cigars and a document, a 2-page document labeled Special Orders number 191, confidential at the top, addressed to a divisional commander in Lee's army named Daniel Harvey Hill. The orders then made their way up the chain of command to George McClellan, and the orders outlined the operational plan that Lee had developed in order to surround and capture the federal garrison at Harper's Ferry, which had about 14,000 men in it. And that ended up being a major victory. Stonewall Jackson was responsible for that. But anyway, the orders explained to McClellan that Lee had divided his army into multiple columns. So this is a major intelligence coup, because you want to know, as an army commander, you want to know what your enemy is doing, where his forces are, how strong they are. Now, he didn't have that information in the orders. They didn't say that, but they did at least say where these different commands were, and it informed McClellan, or it confirmed for McClellan, really, because he already kind of knew that Harper's Ferry was in danger of being encircled. And so he then designed an attack that was launched early in the morning or around mid-morning actually on the following day, the 14th, which led to the Battle of South Mountain, which took place at 3 gaps on South Mountain: Turner's Gap, Fox's Gap, and Crampton's Gap. Gaps, by the way, are the term in Maryland for passes. So they're just passes over the mountains. And that defeat of Confederate forces defending those passes over the mountain is what led to the Confederate withdrawal back toward Virginia, but they ended up stopping and fighting at Sharpsburg. So you'll hear me refer to Sharpsburg and Antietam because, as you know, in the American Civil War, the South had its name for battles, which is usually the town it was closest to, and the North ended up naming things close to the bodies of water that were close to them. So it's called Antietam for the Antietam Creek, which ran through the center of the battlefield, and Sharpsburg in the South because of the town. And so we'll get into then the effects of the Battle of Antietam. Now, the material that I'll be presenting here in Calamity at Frederick really originated in 2019 when I was doing presentations with my co-author, Gene Thorpe, for a book called The Tale Untwisted, which was about George McClellan's handling of the lost orders. One of the things that you'll note, you may have run across, or you will run across if you decide to read more about this, is that George McClellan did not use the information, this is the accusation, did not use the information accurately that he found in the, or advantageously in the orders that were lost and then recovered. That he dawdled for 18 hours, and that he then basically squandered the opportunity that he had to destroy Lee's army piecemeal. And so we would always get questions at the end. Well, who lost the orders? Where were they lost? What are the circumstances of all this? I didn't have any good answers at the time. All I could tell people is, well, you have to just read the literature and see what you can find. But ended up doing the research on it because I wanted to square the circle, right? I didn't want to tell just half the story, the Union side of the story. So that book you can get on savaspeedy.com. I would recommend that you go there because if you want to support a Civil War publisher, you're going to want to support Savas-Beatty because they publish so many books on the Civil War. Amazon, Savas-Beatty gets probably $1 for every book that is published, and then I get probably a quarter. So there isn't much that we make from Amazon there. But anyway, the title of the book refers to a statement that Robert E. Lee wrote to Daniel Harvey Hill after the war. And telling Lee Hill in 1868, and I quote, "At the time the order, meaning Special Orders number 191, fell into General McClellan's hands, I considered it a great calamity." And then Lee added, "Subsequent reflection has not caused me to change my opinion." And so today I'll try to explain what the general meant by this. Perfect. So here's the agenda for my talk. I've divided it into about 5 parts of 10 minutes apiece for a total of 50 minutes or so. So by the time we wrap up, I hope you'll know a lot more about the history of the orders.
He's going way forward.
It's like on
Great,
play.
lovely. Wonder why it's doing that. This is why I gave you the PDF, because it tends to do that. Okay, so I'm going to slide 3 anyway. Are you going to stay? Are you going to stay? Good. Okay. So let's begin with the historical context. So General Lee led his army into Maryland with 3 broad objectives, 2 of which quickly became interrelated. The practical goal of securing provisions and supplies for his men is self-evident, and I'm not going to dwell on that. Those of you who are familiar with the letters that Lee may have written to President Davis before he crossed the Potomac River on the morning of September 6th will recall that the general said that he hoped to find food and fodder for his army. After more than a year of war in Northern Virginia, those things have been completely exhausted by the armies moving back and forth across the area. In addition, the supply line from Richmond was really incapable of supplying Lee's army with the provisions that it needed. Now, Maryland remained untouched by the war, and like many in his army, Lee believed that because it was a slaveholding state in the border south and home to a large secessionist minority, it contained a population sympathetic to the Confederate cause. He thought, therefore, that his men could find what they needed to survive and rely on generosity of the locals. And it's with that in mind that he started pushing columns across on September 4th. The September 6th date that I mentioned is when Lee himself crossed the river. I'm going to pause and wait for this to change. There we go. So turning to Lee's political objectives, the evidence shows that he entered Maryland in the hope that the presence of his army would instigate an insurrection against the national government. Now, based on this topic, how this topic is treated in most of the literature, I would guess that many of you have not heard that claim. And so for those who want to know more about it, I've collected on this slide most of the statements that Lee made about it or which are attributed to him. In the interest of time, I'm not going to talk through them. You can read them if you want to look back later. But what I would like to point out is that General Lee referred directly to Maryland's secession at least 7 times. There were additional indirect references to the issue as well. And he commented on the subject, this is important, before, during, and after the campaign. So it was one of the themes that he returned to the most often, as a matter of fact. And for this reason alone, I would argue that prying Maryland out of the Union was Lee's primary reason for being there. It wasn't just to give battle. It wasn't just to defeat his troops. It was actually to pull Maryland out of the Union, cut off Washington, and inflame an insurrection in Baltimore, and then push the war up into Pennsylvania. But attempting to achieve this goal also shaped Lee's military objectives. And so to put a finer point on it, I would argue that we cannot properly understand the intent behind or the course of the Maryland campaign of '62 without taking into account these political objectives. If they're not accounted for, it creates a fragmented understanding of what Lee had hoped to accomplish, and it leaves some questions unanswered, including why he chose to fight at Sharpsburg and why he remained in place there on September 18th after a terrible thrashing his army had taken the day before. So let's turn now to Lee's military objectives. After driving George McClellan's army away from Richmond in June, Lee then led the rout of John Pope's Federal Army at 2nd Manassas in late August. Now, following this, General Lee found himself with no opponent left to fight. Yet he was also unable to pursue the enemy into the fortifications of Washington because his army wasn't strong enough to do so. So initially, he planned to fall back to Warrenton, Virginia, which is right there. And the Battle of Manassas took place over here. So he was going to fall back that way. But he quickly changed his mind, and on September 2nd, he decided to cross the Potomac. And this operation then unfolded rapidly, with Lee marching his troops to Leesburg on September 3rd, Leesburg here. And then one day later, the first men of his army under Daniel Harvey Hill crossed at Sheik's Ford. Now, commenting on these events to President Davis on September 4th, Lee also stated, and I quote, "Should the results of the expedition justify it, I propose to enter Pennsylvania, unless you should deem it unadvisable on political or other grounds." Now, this statement indicates how at the beginning of the campaign, Lee also entertained designs on pushing into Pennsylvania, much as he would the following summer with the Gettysburg campaign. Now, conducting such an operation meant, however, that he needed to shift his supply line west. And so he moved it into the Shenandoah Valley, starting here at the railhead at Culpeper, so that the wagons could then carry the rest of the supplies the rest of the way, and then eventually meet at this rally point here at Hagerstown. So you can see how Lee is setting up with this operation. He's setting up potential move into Pennsylvania. Now, the green arrows here indicate generally where his army moved. These red arrows are where he ended up wanting to move. And then, of course, he also gave orders right before the army crossed the Potomac that stragglers collecting here at Leesburg were to march across the mountains and meet the army at Winchester, which was going to be his depot. So for the next 3 days, Lee continued this work, writing about it on the mornings of September 7th and September 8th. This is after he's outside of Frederick, camped at a place called the Best Farm, about 4 miles south of Frederick City. In addition, Lee anticipated that Federals at Martinsburg and Harper's Ferry, so there are troops here, and then there are also Martinsburg right out here in the middle here, he anticipated that they would evacuate north once they realized they had been cut off from Washington. He thought this would leave the road clear for his wagon train then to clear all the way to Hagerstown. Now, moving to Hagerstown eventually, he wrote to Davis on September 9th and then again on the 12th was the direction that he originally intended, confirming it was his rally point for the early phase of the operation. Now, getting there would prove useful to Lee if the general decided to push his army farther north, or if circumstances forced him to fight it out of Maryland. Whichever scenario eventually developed, Lee felt certain that the demoralized and disorganized condition of the enemy would give him enough time to operate on what he called the northern frontier, and that's a quote, as he put it, until the end of the campaigning season. If the Federals declined to give battle, Lee hoped to at least annoy and harass them as the opportunity presented itself. So these then were the assumptions that are underlying Lee's operation until the morning of September 8th. As we know, events in Maryland didn't work out to Lee's satisfaction for the first couple of days that he was there. The civilian population did not rise up immediately, and recruits did not arrive in large numbers. To be fair, we're only talking about 48 hours though, right? So that's not a lot of time. But equally important is the fact that General Lee also learned some information while at Frederick on the morning of September 8th that caused him to modify his thinking about the situation. So on the evening of September 6th, after he had settled in at the Best Farm, General Lee accepted an invitation to dinner in the city. Now, I've come to suspect that the reason he did so was to speak with at least one representative of the secessionist community in Baltimore. But so far, I've been unable to identify who that person might have been. In any case, he learned at the dinner that locals did not know why he and his army had come. They therefore asked the general to declare it publicly, which is why he then ordered Charles Marshall, a native Marylander and an aide on his staff, to compose a proclamation to the people of the state that was then published on September 8th. So Marshall wrote the proclamation on the 7th of September after finding out the day before that he was needed, and then it was published the next day. In this proclamation, Lee stated in no uncertain terms, and I quote, "Our army is prepared to assist you with the power of its arms in regaining the rights of which you have been despoiled. This, citizens of Maryland, is our mission," unquote. Now, Lee also learned from his hosts that he should not expect an uprising of the populace unless his army could prove that it could protect the people from federal retaliation. This is why Lee wrote to Davis on September 7th, so the morning after the dinner in Frederick, and I quote, "Situated as Maryland is, I do not anticipate any general uprising of the people on our behalf," unquote. The general also explained later in his campaign report, and I quote, "The difficulties that surrounded them, Marylanders, were fully appreciated unless success should give them assurance of continued protection," unquote. Now, reading this comment makes comprehensible a statement attributed to Lee, which appeared in the Philadelphia Inquirer of all places on September 12th. Why this comment was printed in a northern newspaper is unclear, although I tend to think that Lee had it planted there to alert Maryland secessionists about his intentions. And this statement read, "We have come to redeem our pledge to the people of this state and extend the olive branch to them. Should they accept it, we shall welcome them and protect them with the assurance that the next battleground will be in Pennsylvania. But should they not come forward, the battleground must hereafter be in Maryland." So these words make clear that within 24 hours of Lee being in Maryland, he came to understand that no rebellion would occur in the state unless his army won a victory. Doing so would give Confederate sympathizers the confidence to rise up. And so, influenced by these considerations, Lee put his army into motion. There we go. So this is the context Lee found himself in on the morning of September 8th, when two unexpected pieces of information reached him. Now, the order of their arrival isn't known. What's important is that they reached him at roughly the same time. Now, the first piece came from Captain Elijah Veers White, the commander of the Loudoun Border Cavalry, and that's named after this this county down here. You can't see it, it's really off the map here, but Loudoun County is right where Leesburg is. This is Elijah Veers White here, and Lee sent him on a scouting expedition to Harper's Ferry in order to find out if there were federal troops still there. Now, to the general's astonishment, when Veers reported that, or White reported that several thousand federal soldiers still held the garrison. Now, this dispelled Lee's belief, which he admitted had been based solely on a rumor that the enemy had abandoned the post and marched north. Instead, a strong force remained in place close to the supply line. Remember that supply line that I showed you, that Lee was trying to organize for his eventual operation in Pennsylvania. So, and at that time, at the same time, roughly, information came in from Jeb Stewart, who has a cavalry screen that is operating east of Frederick. So here's Frederick, and that's the road to Baltimore. That's the road to Washington, D.C. This area right here is where Stewart is operating. And so he reported to Lee that a large federal force was moving toward Frederick. Now, Lee's assumption after Second Manassas, the Battle of Second Manassas, had been that the enemy was too demoralized and disorganized, and those are Lee's words, to resume offensive operations. This meant that he thought he had weeks, if not months, to resume or to operate on the Confederacy's northern frontier. And recent intelligence seemed to confirm this inactivity too, with Lee noting on the morning of September 8th, before he had received the news from Stewart and White, and I quote, "As far as I can learn, the enemy are not moving in this direction, but continue to concentrate about Washington." Now, the reason he wrote that on the morning of September 8th is because he hadn't received that information, right? So suddenly everything had changed, and as opposed to being in an advantageous position with time to wait for Maryland to respond to his proclamation and the latitude to move where he wanted, when he wanted, General Lee suddenly found his army in between two forces. So he needed a plan to address the situation. And yet, even at this moment of growing peril, he thought he had an opportunity to strike a blow at the enemy. So he wouldn't need to wait for weeks to prove his army's willingness to spill blood for Maryland's liberation. He could do it within days. But first, he needed to eliminate the threat to his rear. And so he called Stonewall Jackson into his tent to discuss their options. As we know from his post-war writings, James Longstreet also stumbled onto this meeting, and Lee invited him to participate as well. And together, the three men hashed out a plan to capture Harper's Ferry and then to reassemble the army between Hagerstown and Boonesboro, which you can't really see on the top of the map on this one, but you'll see it later, for a decisive clash with the Army of the Potomac. We know this because in Lee's campaign report, he explained that by threatening Pennsylvania, quote unquote, he hoped to induce the enemy to follow him west of South Mountain, where his army then could confront the federal force. So in short, while Harper's Ferry was a problem, it also provided Lee with the opportunity to capture valuable supplies and weapons prior to fighting the main federal force that was pursuing him. The ensuing battle that Lee planned to fight would then take place in Maryland, and if it ended in a victory, it would prove his ability to protect the state's secessionists who could then carry Maryland out of the Union. So his political and military role objectives had come fully together. So after the conference's conclusion, General Lee issued verbal instructions that placed Stonewall Jackson in command of the expedition before putting those orders in writing on the following day. So I'm guessing that some of you at this point who are familiar with this are wondering how this could have taken place on September 9th when Lee did not dictate his orders, Special Orders number 191, until the following day, September 9th. One piece of evidence supporting the September 8th date comes from James Longstreet, who wrote after the war that the meeting took place a day or two after we reached Frederick City. The second source is the diary of a North Carolina soldier named James Shinn. Now, his brigade at the time was part of D.H. Hill's division. And on September 8th, the brigade received orders to march from its encampment southwest of Frederick to a new location east of the Monocacy River, which runs east of Frederick, north to south. We also find in Shinn's diary that his regiment received orders to cook 3 days' rations. So Longstreet's comment in Shinn's diary support the conclusion that the headquarters meeting between Jackson, Longstreet, and Lee took place on the morning of September 8th. If the conference did not take place that day, there's no way to explain why D.H. Hill ordered one of his brigades to cross the Monocacy River to the east. And the reason that's important is because D.H. Hill is designated in Special Orders number 191 as the formation of the division that will bring up the rear of the army. So it's supposed to basically be a rear guard, although that task really falls formally to Jeb Stewart. But in terms of the infantry guard, D.H. Hill is supposed to be at the rear. So if he moves his brigade to the far edge of the Confederate army on the east side of the Monocacy River, and the rest of the army is moving to the west, that's what makes that important. So Hill must have received this order from Jackson to make this redeployment after Lee had designated his division of the wagon trains guard for the operation. So now let's move to the creation of the orders themselves. Now this slide provides estimates of the time when these events took place. It also shows images of some of the documents that were produced. Now, we know from the sources that John Walker's division reached the vicinity of Best's farm from Virginia around 10 o'clock in the morning. Walker reported to General Lee, who promptly sent him back to the Potomac River to destroy the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal aqueduct at the mouth of the Monocacy River. Now, this is, of course, a task that had been designated to Harvey Hill, but he had failed to accomplish it several days earlier because Hill didn't have any tools and he had no explosives. And the masonry that this aqueduct is made of is absolutely massive. We're talking about stones that weigh several tons. So without any equipment or any explosives to take care of to blow the thing up, there was no way that they could do anything about it. Lee ordered Walker to do the job and to finish quickly and then to meet the rest of the army in Middletown, Maryland. But again, he didn't give Walker any explosives or tools, so Walker ends up not being able to finish the job either. It's one of these kind of weird things that, you wonder what kind of planning goes into an operation like this, especially for Lee, because he's an engineer, right, by training. Once Walker departed from headquarters, General Lee finally had the time he needed to dictate his orders to Charles Marshall. Now, he chose Marshall because news had recently arrived that Jefferson Davis was en route from Richmond to meet the army in Maryland. Lee immediately detailed his other aide, Walter Taylor, who's the more famous of the two. You may have heard of Walter Taylor's name before, to intercept the president and dissuade him from coming into Maryland. So Taylor was unavailable to take dictation. Now, turning to the documents themselves, you'll notice that there are two of them here, and they are labeled Special Orders Number 190 and Special Orders Number 191. Now, this is because Lee dictated each document separately. Only later did another aide on his staff named Captain Arthur Mason combine them into a full 10-paragraph document that appears in the official records of the War of the Rebellion. They started out as separate, however, with 190 containing paragraphs 3 through 10, and 191 containing only paragraphs 1 and 2. Now, why Lee did this remains unclear, although it may have had something to do with the content of each document. Special Orders 190 contains specific instructions for the commands of Lee's army, whereas Special Orders 191 pertain to keeping the men out of Frederick and also to detailing Walter Taylor's mission. Those subjects had nothing to do with the operation of the army, and therefore it made sense to keep them separate, because special orders are orders for movement. General orders are general orders such as men shall wear their cover when they're outside, or things like that. Not that the army is moving or anything. It's furthermore clear that Special Orders Number 190, which can be found in Lee's papers at the Library of Virginia, is a draft. This is illustrated by the fact that it is not marked confidential anywhere on the document. Usually there's a confidential up here somewhere. It's not marked there. It's also not addressed to any particular recipient. It is, however, signed by Colonel Robert Chilton down here. That's another one of Chilton's signatures right there. And that's Lee's chief of staff. So that the copyist would know it's an official document, even though it's not written as confidential or addressed to someone. Concerning the 2-paragraph version of 191, we can tell this document is a final version because it's addressed to General Samuel Cooper in Richmond. So it's got the recipient written right here, and signed by Chilton as well. I haven't been able to find the final or the draft of the 2-paragraph version of 191. This is a final copy. So once Lee had dictated the originals, they went to the adjutant's tent, which is normally occupied by Walter Taylor. But with Taylor preparing to leave for Virginia, his older brother, Major Richard Cornelius Taylor, took his place. Now, we know this because of a statement in Charles Venable's unfinished war memoir that states, and I quote, a dictation by General Lee was copied carefully in the adjutant's tent by Colonel Taylor's aide and brother in the camp at Frederick City, unquote. Major Dick Taylor then sent these copies to the commanders of the corps and divisions who were concerned, with the copies marked confidential at the top of the document. We can also assume that this process took place around noon because of an underlined 12 on this copy of the document that was lost. So in other words, if Venable, and Venable is another member of Lee's staff, if he's to be believed, General Lee or Colonel Chilton we don't know which one, entrusted the distribution of this critically important document to a novice on his staff. He had no staff experience. So copies of the orders went out throughout the day, and that's represented by these different arrows. So this arrow, for example, goes down to where Stewart's command is down here in Urbana. There's another arrow that goes over here to where D.H. Hill's command was located, and then another arrow that continues to go down to Walker, who is down off the map toward the Potomac River. And this is, of course, Frederick City right here. This is the national road that goes to Baltimore. This is the Georgetown Pike, which goes to D.C. So it's that kind of a crossroads right there. Jackson and Longstreet probably received their orders first because of their proximity to General Lee's headquarters. We also know that Lafayette McLaws, a divisional commander in the Army, received his copy later in the afternoon, and John Walker received his copy that night. Now, this map depicts also a copy going to D.H. Hill with his headquarters marked as number 2, right here, southwest of Best's Grove, where Army headquarters is. The location is close to what's called Ballinger's Creek, right here, because that's where the available sources place Hill's division. I have found no evidence stating that Lee's headquarters sent a copy to Hill. The arrow here is simply intended to show the direction it would have gone. The reason being that the order was found somewhere up here, and there were claims made by federal officers that they found the orders at the encampment of a former Confederate encampment, and it must have been D.H. Hill's because D.H. Hill's name was on the orders. Now, I've read through all the documents and the accounts of the discovery, and there isn't a single one that provides any details of what one would expect to find if a division of troops, anywhere from 5,000 to 10,000 men, had camped at a place for 4 days. There's no mentions of refuse, there's no campfire rings, no broken equipment, no remains of butchered animals, no corpses. And then we have accounts of all of these things being found in both Best's farm, where Longstreet's command is mostly camped, and also along the roads leading up into Frederick, because these are where Jackson's command camped. Common sense dictates that they also should have found the lost orders, that these things should have been found at the lost orders discovery site. Instead, we find comments about clean grass, clover, and wheat. Taken in concert with the evidence that shows Hill's division camped elsewhere, it is reasonable to conclude that the document was dropped in a place where it never should have been. There is therefore no reason to suspect that General Hill ever saw it, or to suspect that a courier dropped it there. Those are usually the two accusations that are leveled. Either General Hill lost it, a member of his staff lost it, or a courier on his way to General Hill lost it. But the location is simply too far in the opposite direction for either of these things to have been plausible. So before turning to the question of who might have lost the orders, let's look at the evidence for where they were found. Now this slide shows the area southeast of Frederick City, where the numbered circles are estimates, those of mine and other people, where Corporal Barton Mitchell here, the man who found the drop copy of Special Orders number 191. Now the site labeled number 1 mile from Frederick, right here, is the farm of a man named Myers. This site down here is the estimate of the discovery location produced by the National Park Service at the Monocacy Battlefield, which is currently located, the visitor center is currently located here. They based their estimate on the discovery at Old Farm Lane, which you can actually see this sort of dotted line right here that led from Crumbs Ford, where the 12th Corps, which the 27th Indiana was in the vanguard of, the 12th Corps moved up toward Frederick this way. But they assumed that because one of the participants in the discovery said that converging columns of troops kept us from moving any farther, they assumed that it meant that they had come this way and run into the 2nd Corps, which is moving up the Georgetown Pike. And Rino's 9th Corps is moving this way into Frederick. The sources for the discovery event mention converging columns of infantry that blocked the 12th Corps' further advance during the morning of September 13th. My estimate for the discovery site is labeled number 2, right here. And it's based on the official history of the 27th Indiana, which said that the regiment's skirmish line halted in a clover field adjoining the city on the south. A local historian for Frederick also concluded from this that the discovery probably took place in what is now known as Grove Park, which is just a ball field close to the intersection of three streets: East South Street right here, Franklin Street, and Iamsville Road, which is this road that leads to a town called Iamsville, which is off the map over this direction. Now, stepping back, I'll summarize the event. Late on the morning of September 13th, the 1st Division of the 12th Corps began crossing the Monocacy River with the 27th Indiana and its vanguard. After they had completed the crossing, the commander of the 3rd Brigade, George H. Gordon, ordered Colonel Colgrove to shake out a line of skirmishers. Colgrove ordered one platoon from Company F to proceed north along the left side of the Iamsville Road toward Frederick. He then shook out a second platoon from Company F on the east side of the Iamsville Road. Both platoons were under the command of a man named Peter Cobb, who was later killed at Antietam. But he appears to have remained with the platoon on the right side of the road. Meanwhile, on the left side of the road, this man, First Sergeant John McKnight Bloss, was in command of the platoon. The lines were not aligned with one another because they had been shaken out at different times, so they moved this way toward Frederick City. Now, behind that, there was another skirmish line of 300 feet that was the rest of the regiment, and then behind that, the rest of the companies. The rest of the regiment then followed 1,200 feet behind that. And these estimates all come from Hardee's rifle tactics, which was the standard instruction manual in use at the time. By shaking out platoon strength skirmish lines, Colgrove showed that he followed the process. So I think that he must have followed it all the way through. This meant that the skirmishers from the front of his regiment to the end of his regiment were probably stretched about 1,500 feet or a quarter of a mile. The rest of the 3rd Brigade, the 1st Division, and the 12th Corps then came up behind them on the Iamsville Road in column. Colgrove's men pushed toward Frederick until they could go no farther because of converging columns of infantry advancing on the road into Frederick via the National Road and the Georgetown Pike. Now, by my estimate, Company F's skirmish line came to a stop around noon, just past the intersection of East South Street, Franklin Street, and the Iamsville Road. After Bloss and his comrades stopped, the men rested in the tall grass under a locust tree and near some small shrubs at a place where there had once been a fence line. This is all stuff that's recorded in the documents themselves. And it's here that Barton Mitchell spotted this packet lying in the grass. He picked it up, opened it, and 2 cigars, not 3, 2 cigars fell out. Some people are hung up on the cigar thing, so I make sure that it's 2 cigars. Mitchell then read through the document with a comrade named John Campbell looking over his shoulder. Bloss asked to see what Mitchell had found. Mitchell handed over the document, and Bloss himself began reading it, rising to his feet as he did and reading it out loud. The document's contents electrified him, and he immediately ran back to Colonel Colgrove, who was still in the saddle, to give him the document and tell him what he had found. Then the document went up to George Gordon, then went up to Alpheus Williams, the Corps commander, et cetera, until it reached George McClellan sometime around between 1 and 2:30 that afternoon. I'm waiting for it to, is it going to stay? Okay, good. So here's a close-up of where I believe the discovery site is. You can see it down here at the bottom of the map. There are several reasons why I think this was the place. The first, John Bloss described the site as follows in 1892. We moved forward rapidly, discovered no enemy, and soon reached the suburbs of the city where the converging lines of other division and corps caused us to halt. We are now in the meadow near the city limits. Compare this with his description from late September 1862. On the morning of the 13th, the 12th Corps marched in the direction of Frederick, and at early noon, it reached the outskirts of the city where converging lines and columns of other commands caused it to halt in a meadow. Bloss also described the meadow as a wheat field. According to the sergeant then, Mitchell found the orders in a meadow near the city limits of Frederick. The one thing I can show you on this map is these are the city limits of Frederick, and they're marked on the road by stones. So there was an opportunity to know that they were at the city limits. The official history of the 27th Indiana also recorded the spot as being in a clover field adjoining the city on the south. There the men lay down upon the clean grass. Now, the word adjoining is specifically defined as next to or attached to, indicating the location must have been immediately beside Frederick. William Hostetter of Company A, located in the rear of the rest of the 27th Indiana, also stated in a sworn affidavit that he and his comrades had stopped near the city limits in a meadow. Enoch Boycourt, another member of the company, testified that they went forward in the skirmish line, and when near Frederick City, the line stopped to rest in an old meadow. So it appears to have been here then that Mitchell spotted the folded document. If you'll notice that the other location that I pointed out to you, the one that was off the map here a mile away is too far away to be adjoining the city of Frederick. And then the location that the National Park Service estimates is 3 miles away. That is absolutely impossible if adjoining is the word that you're going to use for where the orders were found. Concerning the converging columns, by noon on September 13th, 9th Corps troops were advancing into Frederick along the National Road, about 1,200 feet to Company F's right. So Bloss and his men could see and hear them. To the left, the 2nd Corps had multiple regimental bands blaring, and they moved toward Frederick on the pike that led to Central Street in Frederick called Market Street. Bloss and his comrades could probably not see this column, but it's almost certain that they could hear it. So the 12th Corps could only continue to advance if it took either Franklin Street this way, which would have brought it in contact with the 9th Corps, or if it had taken South Street this way, which would have brought it in contact with the 2nd Corps. And that's why Bloss said there's no way they could have moved forward. All right. So this slide shows various individuals, and beside them is a table with columns listing the criteria that I use to describe determine the potential culpability of everyone involved. And the criteria are as follows. Did the individual have access to the orders? Is there evidence that the individual had a copy of the orders in his possession? Did the individual have a reason to be carrying the orders? Is there evidence that placing that individual near the discovery site? So my objective for this exercise is to disqualify individuals based on the level of speculation there is according to their or related to their name. So as you can see, each person here had access to the orders. But when it comes to direct evidence that they did possess a copy, the possibilities narrow considerably. So for example, we know that Jackson transmitted a copy of the orders to D.H. Hill near Frederick, and that Hill kept those orders for the rest of his life. You can still find them online. They're available. You can download a copy of them and look at it yourself. If you can read it. Jackson's handwriting is as bad as any doctor's today. We also know, however, that Hill's command camped miles from the place where they were found. So the order's location, remember, was an outlier. As for the headquarters couriers, we know they delivered copies to McLaws and Walker, so there's evidence for touching copies of the document. What we don't know is if Dick Taylor sent a courier with the copy of the orders to D.H. Hill. So when it comes to Jackson's staff, we know that Jackson himself possessed a copy of the orders because his copy survived, because the copy that he sent to D.H. Hill was based on his copy. This meant a member of Jackson's headquarters staff could have copied it as well, but there's no evidence that anyone did so other than a statement made by Tom Rosser after the war. Rosser, who commanded the 5th Virginia Cavalry in Maryland, claimed in 1897, so that's 35 years later, that the culprit who lost the orders came from Jackson's headquarters and that the guilty individual was still alive, but he offered no proof. Now, ever since Rosser spoke those words, speculation has surrounded people such as Henry Kidd Douglas, who was still alive in the 1890s. But to be clear on this point, there's no evidence that Douglas was responsible. There's only Rosser's comment, which is strangely detailed despite the fact that his regiment was not posted near Frederick on September 9th. So if someone told him about the evidence later on, it means that Rosser's comment is hearsay and really must be considered unreliable. Finally, there's William Pendleton to consider, this man down here. He's Lee's artillery chief. We know Pendleton had knew Lee's plans because he wrote about them in a letter to his wife in general terms on September 10th. But he also had a reason to be carrying the orders because paragraph 7 mentioned the reserve artillery, which is his command. That said, there's no direct evidence placing Pendleton at or near the discovery site. I've written about this in the previous book called There, Maryland, where I developed a speculative case for Pendleton's guilt. It's still just speculative, but I looked at the evidence there. Now, this is the same table for Lee's headquarters staff. And as you can see, all these men had access to the orders. There's also evidence that some of them touched the orders, such as Robert Chilton. Charles Marshall wrote out the drafts, and Charles Venable stated that Dick Taylor had made the copies out and distributed. So each of them also had access. The potential guilt for each man losing the orders fails, however, when we ask if he had a reason to be carrying them or if there was evidence placing them near the discovery site. There isn't in either case. So finally, Walter Taylor can be ruled out for reasons that I've already explained. So this leaves the final individual that I examined, Jeb Stewart. His relation to the orders is curious. We know Stewart had access to them because eyewitness statements placed him at Army headquarters on the afternoon of September 9th. There's also a comment in Stewart's campaign report, which I've shown on the right side of the slide right here, confirming that he had a copy in his possession. So in addition, Stewart had a reason to be carrying them, this being his mission to hold back the advancing Federals for as long as he could and to mask the operations of the Army against Harper's Ferry. Finally, there is evidence placing Stewart very close to the site where the orders are discovered. So in short, Stewart checks all the boxes, but here let's take a closer look. So here again is that close-up of the lost orders discovery site. You'll notice this time that I'd have added a feature right here. And that's an estimate of where Stewart's headquarters was overnight from September 11th to 12th. Remember, the orders were found on the morning of the 13th. I believe this is where Stewart camped with his entourage, wagon train, and at least a portion of Wade Hampton's Fitzie's cavalry. This information is new. I haven't been able to find other history of the campaign that pinpoints the location of Stewart's headquarters during these days. But knowing where it was important because it shows that of all the men who had a copy of Special Orders number 191, the only one who can be physically placed close to where the orders were discovered is Jeb Stewart. My estimate is based on several pieces of evidence. First, Stewart's chief of staff, Harold von Bork, wrote after the war that they, quote, fixed their headquarters of the farmhouse of an old Irishman, unquote, about a half mile from Frederick. The home of Augustin D. O'Leary, right here, is closer than a half mile from Frederick, but von Bork wrote this several years later, so, it's understandable to get the distance wrong. Second, von Bork also noted that the Irishman who hosted them had a beautiful brogue. O'Leary emigrated to the United States when he was 15 years of age, which is old enough to have acquired an accent before he left. Third, von Bork added that the elderly Irishman's pretty daughters entertained them with a lively little dance at night. Of course they did. This is Jeb Stewart we're talking about, right? There must be dancing girls. Census records show that Mr. O'Leary had 3 daughters living with him. In fact, Stewart almost certainly knew the O'Leary family through one of those daughters because she had dined with him at the home of a woman named Catherine Markell, a Confederate sympathizer, while in Frederick. Markell recorded this this event in her diary. Additional sources also report Stewart being spotted near the rail yard, which is just right here off the map, close to the O'Leary house on an afternoon of September 12th. So these details convince me that Stewart camped on the farm of Augustin D. O'Leary. And if I'm correct, it also puts a copy of Special Orders number 191 within a quarter mile of my proposed discovery site. So let's turn to some additional considerations. Now, these are speculative, but I like to offer them to stimulate some thinking and also some discussion at your next meeting, your talk. What restaurant is that? First, it suggests that Stewart probably picked up a copy of the orders at Army headquarters on September 9th. The sources show him there on the afternoon of that day, which would explain why there's no record of a courier being sent to him. Second, an analysis of the handwriting in the lost orders that I conducted for about 5 months points to Lee's secretary, Armistead Long, as being the document's writer. Now, I could spend an hour on this subject alone, but suffice to say for our purposes that after several months of analysis, I found Long's handwriting matched in other documents, matched the handwriting in the lost orders document more closely than any other person. Now, this raises additional questions because if Long did write out the copy for Stewart, did General Lee order him to do it? And did Long use the unsent copy for D.H. Hill that was lying around headquarters in the adjutant's tent as his template? Third, we need to explain the cigars. This is possible based on a statement in von Bork's memoir saying that on September 9th, he and Stewart enjoyed smoking cigars in Urbana with a Mr. Cockey, who was the owner of the land where they camped. Did Cockey give Stewart the 2 cigars to take with him as a gift when his command pulled out on September 11th? Fourth, the copy of the orders allegedly appended to Stewart's campaign report are missing. Why is this? Were they ever actually attached, or were they themselves lost over the years? So we have 2 copies of lost orders. Or did Stewart write that they were attached for to cover for his having lost them in 1862? One of the things to remember about Stewart's report is that he filed it for the Maryland campaign. He filed it in February of 1864. So a lot of time has passed. Fifth, it rained heavily overnight from September 11th to September 11th to the morning of the 12th, but there's no damage on the lost orders. This suggests they were either dropped after the rain had ended or on the morning of the 12th, probably maybe under the locust tree or one of the bushes. We simply don't know. Lastly, there's a curious note that Stewart wrote to General Lee on the night of September 13th, alleging that a gentleman of Maryland had ridden through the lines from Frederick to warn Lee that McClellan had received an important document. I find this fishy. This is an incident when McClellan is alleged to have thrown his hands in the air and shouted, "Now I know what to do." So there is one thing, no reason for McClellan to have said such a thing. He knew in general terms where Lee's army was. He also knew that Harper's Ferry was in danger. He so much so, in fact, that he ordered Pleasanton's cavalry that was making approaches to Harper's Ferry to occasionally fire cannons so that they could hear in Harper's Ferry to know that the relief was on their way. McClellan did not know that Lee had separated his forces as widely as he had, but he did know that Confederate troops had been seen near Hagerstown, Williamsport, and Burkittsville, which is a small town in the next valley over. So in short, he was not entirely in the dark as his alleged explanation would suggest. There's also no story for the Confederate source for that story other than, does anyone know where the Gentleman of Maryland story comes from? Robert E. Lee. He mentions it in 1868 in a conversation when he's angry about an article that D.H. Hill published in a journal, and he didn't care for Hill's characterization of the campaign because Hill argued that the loss of the orders actually saved the campaign. And Lee was infuriated by that because it was so ridiculous. So how can a civilian, and I want to ask this honestly, how can a civilian walk up to the tent of a major general and pass on a piece of key information without anyone hearing about it? There's no one on Stewart's staff commented about it during the war or after. There's no mention of it in Lee's campaign report, no mention of it in Stewart's campaign report either. Why would Stewart leave out a detail such as this? So for reference, or to give you a comparison, a very similar thing happened during the Gettysburg campaign. James Longstreet's spy, Harrison, approached Longstreet's encampment, and when he contacted him, Longstreet included that detail in his campaign report. Lee also commented on in his campaign report, and a member of Longstreet's staff commented in a memoir after the war. So why is there no equivalent record of this event happening in the Maryland campaign? Also important, there's no federal source which mentions George McClellan getting all excited. This is despite embedded reporters at Army headquarters and newspaper reports about the lost orders appearing within 24 hours of their discovery. They appeared with an order from General Lee, if I remember correctly, number 119. So it got the details wrong, but it ended up getting the general gist of the orders correct. That appears within 24 hours. So why did no one witness McClellan getting excited about all this? A possible explanation is that it never actually took place. This event never took place. The other thing is McClellan understood operational security. So even later on that night, after he had designed his strikes on the South Mountain passes, he would not show the entire document to General John Gibbon, who was a friend of his. He turned down a corner of it. And that's when he said, with this paper, I'll whip Bobby Lee or be willing to go home. To me, this behavior strongly suggests McClellan never would have shouted, "Now I know what to do." So we need to ask, did Jeb Stuart contrive this story? Why he would have done so is easy to explain if he had discovered on September 13th that he had lost a copy of the orders entrusted to him. If that occurred, he may have felt the need to warn Lee of the danger without admitting responsibility. So fabricating a story about a gentleman of Maryland and sealing it in a note that he sent to Lee by a courier would do the trick with no witnesses involved. Now, I admit none of this proves that Jeb Stuart lost the orders, but it does give shape to the smoke that's swirling around him, and smoke that I believe is significantly thicker than that surrounding anyone else, including D.H. Hill. So let's move to our final subject. Boy, I hope you folks can see that in the back there. It's a little small. And that's a brief look at the impact of the lost orders on the Confederate operations. And this will also inform your conversation that you'll have next week. So to date, the subject has really only been examined from the perspective of George McClellan's actions and not from the Confederate viewpoint. To that end, then, what did Lee plan to do once that he had the operation against Harper's Ferry had been finished? So in the first place, he intended to bring his army back together in Washington County between Hagerstown and Boonesboro. So Hagerstown is right here. Boonesboro is right here. I live right down over here. Boonesboro is right here. So somewhere in the middle here. This is clearly stated in paragraph 9 of the orders. Once reassembled, Lee planned to give battle west of South Mountain at a location far from federal reinforcements and from the safety of Washington. In short, what Lee seems to have wanted to do was to avoid a repeat of Second Manassas, when he had watched a routed enemy fly into DC and find refuge there. In Maryland, he wanted to defeat the enemy so far from safety that his army could win a complete victory. After shattering McClellan's force, Stuart could then pursue to destroy the remnants in a Napoleonic-style mob-up operation. Secessionist Marylanders would be heartened by the victory and rise in rebellion. And that would take the state out of the Union and potentially force Lincoln to sue for peace, thus securing the Confederacy's independence. Lee therefore hoped to draw the Federals after him by threatening Pennsylvania, not by entering his own admission. Lee also never intended to defend South Mountain. He hoped instead that Stuart could hold off the enemy until Jackson could force the fall of Harper's Ferry by September 14th. Once he had received that news, Lee then planned to recollect his army and have DHL fall back to join Longstreet along the heights of a place called Beaver Creek, about 2.5 miles north of Boonesboro. One thing you can't see here is that there are heights here that are roughly 600 feet high. Here they could pin McClellan in place until Jackson rejoined the army via Williamsport, a route, incidentally, that would have brought Jackson's command onto the field on the Federal left flank. So if Jackson crossed here and struck the Federals here, which without being held pinned in place here, there would have been a fight here instead of down here at Antietam. McClellan, moving faster than Lee found convenient, ended these plans. Instead of allowing Lee to choose the battlefield, McClellan forced him to defend the South Mountain passes, and this compelled James Longstreet's rump command on the quick march back from the area of Funkstown, Hagerstown. Longstreet lost an estimated 50% of his combat strength during this march. His men and those of DHL then suffered thousands of casualties in a demoralizing defeat, which then caused Lee to abandon the plan to move north and instead move back toward Virginia. So for a short time, Lee considered abandoning Maryland altogether, but he recovered on the morning of daybreak of September 15th and decided to stay put. Now, I believe he did so because he still hoped to inflict a defeat on McClellan's army that would encourage Maryland's secession and win the state for the Confederacy. To put it more simply, Lee's goal for the campaign was to win Maryland itself by achieving what Lee called a military success in his post-campaign report. McClellan's victory on September 14th, however, shook the notion that Lee could accomplish this objective, and then days later, the defeat at Antietam shattered it completely, or the reverse, at least, at Antietam shattered it completely. Forced to reassemble his army faster than he had anticipated, General Lee demanded forced marches from Harper's Ferry that left exhausted and broken down men strewn all across Jefferson County, Virginia. Harper's Ferry is down here, and this is where the majority of Lee's army is. General McLaws, for example, complained that he went in and fight at Antietam with a considerably reduced command. McLaws claimed he lost so many men to straggling, in fact, that the day after the Battle of Antietam, his division made up nearly all of its combat losses by people returning to the ranks who had fallen on the wayside on the way from Harper's Ferry to Sharpsburg. There are multiple tantalizing reports along these lines that also hint at the disintegration of Lee's army from September 14th onward. If you've taken a look at Scott Hartwig's I Dread the Thought of the Place, his history of the Battle of Antietam, he mentions constantly the problems with straggling and reduced strength of the Confederate army caused by that. So in other words, by attacking South Mountain due to what he had read in his lost orders and by inflicting a defeat on the Confederates there, George McClellan gave himself a chance to fight a significantly weakened enemy at Antietam. In addition, I'd argue that the position that Lee took up at Sharpsburg was a bad one, to quote the general himself, when it's compared to his position that he had planned to take at Beaver Creek. The Beaver Creek position had the benefit of being anchored by steep terrain on the right flank when seen from Lee's perspective, and by being only 1,100 yards from South Mountain on the left flank. So had Lee been able to fight at Beaver Creek, McClellan would have found the Confederate left very vulnerable to only brigade strength attacks due to the narrowness of the space between the end of the heights and South Mountain. At Antietam, McClellan is able to direct multiple corps against the Confederate left. The specifics of those attacks are beyond the scope of this talk, but what I would like to point out is that McClellan's industry leading up to South Mountain forced Lee to take up a position that suited his purposes and his army less favorably than the position that he had hoped to take. I'd argue McClellan actually gave himself a more advantageous field on which to fight, although I'm sure that he would probably differ with me when looking at those heights at the time. He didn't know it, but in hindsight, it's obvious. So these then are the effects that the loss of the orders had on his operations. And so with that, I'll stop with the formal presentation, but I do want to show just a couple of things right here. So one of the things about the lost orders themselves is that they are often attributed to having been written by Colonel Robert H. Chilton, Lee's chief of staff. And Chilton is condemned for being really a disorganized chief of staff, and that he was the real cause of this problem. And the reason that people think that the orders were signed by Chilton is because a lieutenant on the staff of a corps commander, the 12th Corps commander Alpheus Williams, a man named Samuel Pittman, identified the signature and said, I know this man, I know his signature from dealings we had before the war, and I can verify that this is authentic. These are authentic orders, which they were, but that Chilton wrote them, and that which he did not. And one thing I want to show you here is that these are Chilton's signatures on the 2-paragraph special orders number 191 and then 190, and you can clearly see that these do not match. So there's definitely a problem there with that. And then the last thing I want to show before we open it up for discussion is this is the Armistead long word comparison. It's just a summary of what I came up with. And you can see that there are some words like this, commanding, that's an exact match. And D.H. Hill, that's an exact match. And Chilton or Long also had a very interesting tendency to not complete his D's. So they look like A's. Doesn't have a stem. There's no stem on long documents. There's no stem again. There's a small stem there. So when you take a look at the language itself or the writing itself, it really looks like Armistead Long wrote them and not Robert Chilton. So that's another correction that needs to be made to the history. But with that, I thank you very much for listening, and I'm happy to take questions.
All right.
If I can see you.
This mic is hot. Let me try to turn it down. Any questions from the audience?
Yes, sir. He's bringing the microphone. I'm sorry. He's bringing a microphone down for you so that the people online can hear.
This mic is.
Is it too hot?
Yeah. Let me just try to adjust the volume of this mic. Hopefully, we don't get so much.
This gentleman right here. Yep.
How were all these copies?
Copied by hand, written out.
There was no photocopying.
Yeah, no photocopy. No typewriters.
No text.
No text.
Was there ever any evidence of exactly when Stewart realized that he had lost the orders, and how did they get from where he was encamped, like it looks like a few blocks away, just on the outskirts of town? Is it possible that he gave those orders to a courier who then dropped them?
So I would turn that question on its head and ask, why would Stewart give orders that he was entrusted with to a courier? Who would he be sending them to? They were for him. That was his copy. And the other thing is, there is no evidence of Stewart losing the orders except for the circumstantial evidence that I've presented. So I can't tell you exactly, but I would guarantee it's probably on the 13th somewhere, or because of this gentleman of Maryland note that he ended up sending to Lee. That's my supposition, at least.
He wasn't on his way to maybe see a dancing girl. We got another question back here.
Is it, I think you said that McClellan's hesitation caused about 18 hours of loss of something.
That's the standard interpretation of the events, yes.
Do you agree that he was late or that there was more he could have done to help the situation?
No, categorically disagree with that. McClellan received the orders. See, that argument is based on a claim that McClellan received the orders before noon, so around between 9 and 10 o'clock in the morning, and then did nothing until he ordered an attack on the next day with orders that he sent to William Franklin down around Crampton's Gap, which is 5 miles south of the battlefields in the north. But that, sorry, I lost my train of thought there. But that my impression is that here's the argument, that he issued that order on around 6:20 on the evening of the 13th, and that the attack didn't get off until the next day, and that no men were marching through Frederick that night. There were no night moves. That's the claim, the argument it's always made. Why didn't McClellan advance the army at night? Well, the truth is he actually did. There was at least a brigade of troops from the 9th Corps that marched through Frederick, or were west of Frederick, from the west of Frederick over Catoctin Mountain and camped in Middletown Valley. And even William Franklin had a brigade from his command 5 or 6 miles south of Frederick that marched over the Catoctin Mountains and were in Middletown Valley there as well. And then there are also sources that show that the procession of Union troops through Frederick continued until midnight. And then Reveille, they were given a 3-hour rest, and at 3 o'clock in the morning, it started all over again. So I see no evidence of McClellan having delayed or dawdled or anything. He moved his men with alacrity, as a matter of fact. There's no way that the attack could have taken place the next morning on the 14th if he had not moved that many troops. I see hands in the dark over here.
Yeah, we've got two more over here.
Can we turn on the lights?
Yeah,
we'll turn on the lights.
Yeah, I'll turn on the lights. I don't want to keep anybody in the dark.
I recognize that how the commanders, they organize their personal staff to their own whims.
Yeah.
I find it unusual that apparently you're having a bird colonel writing it out, and then you said hours later another. You would think, didn't they have clerks like, okay, here's the generals, you three, 1, 2, 3, sit at the table, let's write 3 copies and get these things moving.
Yeah.
But they had a bird colonel writing this stuff out.
Yeah, I know, it's bizarre, isn't it? Yeah, I can't explain it, but the Lee seemed to.
I'm retired military. We have clerks for that.
Exactly. Yep. Well, one thing Lee's always considered problematic with Lee is that his staff was so small too. He only had, I don't know, about 6 or 7 men that were a part of his immediate staff, and then there were support staff, other than that. But I mean, George McClellan's staff was 1,200 men. So
we got 2 more questions here.
Yeah.
We're going to start here with Mark.
When did Lee discover that his orders had been neutralized?
in 1863, he didn't discover until the next year.
Oh, he did not know it during the battle.
No, he did not know during the battle. So this is another one of those things that's kind of an axiom in Maryland campaign history that is completely wrong. The argument is that because Jeb Stuart sent this warning on the night of the 13th over the 14th, that Lee received about 1 o'clock in the morning, that Lee must have known that Jeb Stuart, or that his orders had been lost. The problem is we only have Lee's comment, which is just that he said that this gentleman of Maryland had witnessed McClellan. He'd been at headquarters while McClellan received a document, and that he threw his hands up in the air and said, now we know what to do. More tellingly, the next morning, Lee and Longstreet and others made the argument in their reports that they left Hagerstown for South Mountain to return to the fighting and to support D.H. Hill and South Mountain at daybreak. That's absolutely untrue. I have at least a dozen sources which show that they did not get underway until anywhere from 8 to 9:30 in the morning. Some sources even put it at 11 o'clock in the morning. So that's one of the reasons that Longstreet's men had to march on the quick, basically jog for 13 miles in the heat, in order to get back to South Mountain. Oh, and climb a mountain when they got to the battlefield itself. So to me, that indicates that Lee did not know that the orders had fallen to McClellan's hands, because if he did know that, then he would have left it. He would have had Longstreet move at daylight. Yes, sir.
You call them mountains, we call them hills.
Yeah, well, sorry, 1,900 feet, 1,500 feet.
I think at the beginning of your presentation, I think you said that later, after the war, Lee made the claim that actually this wasn't disadvantageous to him. And all this was good. So what was his rationale for saying this all worked out to his benefit?
So the person who made the argument that the loss of the orders was actually an advantage was Daniel Harvey Hill. Was the divisional commander accused of losing them. So he wrote an article in 1868 trying to exonerate himself and to explain how, well, this really wasn't a disadvantage because it caused McClellan to think that we were in one direction when Jackson was able to finish off Harper's Ferry, and then we were able to come to et cetera, right? And Lee found that ridiculous, and that's why he said that it was a calamity that this happened. That's when, yeah, sure.
How did Lee find out that they were lost in 1863? Who told
He
him?
read about it in the newspaper, a northern newspaper.
It's fake news.
Because George McClellan, he published a report because remember Lincoln axes him on the 5th of November. So he then takes several months to write up his report about his time in command of the Army of the Potomac. And he mentions an order of General Lee fell into my hands outside of Frederick on September 13th. And that makes it in the newspaper because they published the report verbatim, which is really interesting what they used to publish in newspapers versus what we see today. I mean, you won't see an Army post-action report or any military post-action report published in the newspaper. But Lee reads it and he goes, oh, I get it.
Okay, we've got one last question. The mic is barely working. So Jim, you're gonna have to.
Well, I talk louder anyway. But just what was the total number of copies made? I'm a little sketchy on that.
I've counted 11.
11.
Yeah, 11 copies because there have to be copies made to be sent to Richmond.
Right.
Too.
And were they all accounted for?
The only ones, well, let's see. Lafayette McLaws says that he had his copy, and we know that he didn't lose it because there's no copy lying around or no copy ended up, finding anywhere. D.H. Hill still had his copy from Jackson. Jackson said that he pinned it in his coat so that it wouldn't be lost. Longstreet said he chewed it up after he read it and spit it out so that it wouldn't be, so that he could destroy it. And then the others, it's hard to say what happened to them. One of them, the 2-paragraph one that I showed you, that obviously made it to Richmond. And then there's also a full copy of the 10 paragraphs that were later integrated by one of Lee's aides, a captain, who was, that document was then found after the war and put into the official records. And that's why we have a 10-paragraph copy. But what's always been kind of baffling to people is why is there a 10-paragraph copy in the official records, but yet the document, when you look at it, only has 7 paragraphs. It's only paragraphs 3 through 10. So that's why I mentioned that the first 2 didn't have anything to do with operations. So that's probably why they were different.
And thus it was missing order 190, not 191.
91, exactly. Yeah. Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
I think we still have a little bit of time to buy a book on your way out.
Oh, yeah. Still have that too.
Alex will be up there taking cash only. It's a cash only bar. Thanks, everybody. Have a good night.
Oh, yeah.